Здравствуйте. Наверное, начнем, не будем ждать. Можно тишину? Начинаем очередную нашу встречу в рамках программы «Теоретические исследования по культурной антропологии». И сегодня у нас в гостях Дидрих Дидрихсен, известный теоретик культуры, искусства, который очень много писал о теории музыки, о поп-культуре, о кино, о театре. И сегодня его лекция посвящена творчеству очень противоречивого и культурного персонажа Кристофа Шлингензифа. К сожалению, в России творчество этого художника и режиссера мало известно, но это понятно, потому что это творчество очень часто считалось трансгрессивным, обсценным, не всегда вписывалось в такой даже критический контекст современного искусства. И сегодня, наверное, особенно интересно вернуться к этим практикам творчества Шлингенсифа, потому что мы прекрасно знаем, что критика традициональных практик сегодня осуществляется многими институциями, многими художественными группами, многими активистскими практиками, но эти критические, скажем так, интервенции, они часто бывают прямолинейными, они очень прямо и однозначно декларируют благие намерения. Если же обратиться к трансгрессивным и субверсивным практикам в кино и в театре Кристофа Шлингензифа, мы увидим, что эти критические политизированные высказывания часто очень неоднозначные, очень обсценные, часто оскорбительные, часто не совсем понятны, являются ли они политически актуальными или, напротив, они пытаются оскорбить общественное мнение и, скажем так, они очень сложно вписывались даже в контекст политической критики современного искусства и современной теории. Поэтому особенно интересно, как сегодня это проинтерпретирует Дидрих Дидрихсен, потому что он хочет подвергнуть сомнению то, что Christoph Schlingensief — это исключительно художник провокации, что слово
Большое спасибо.
Ой, простите, я совершенно забыла представить нашего главного докладчика. Во-первых, Дидрих Дидрихсен — профессор Венской академии искусств и тоже культурный персонаж, который не просто пишет об искусстве, а который создает моду определенных явлений, да, в теории, в музыке, в кино, в театре. И среди его книг «Утопия звука», «Прибавочная стоимость искусства». Кстати, статью из этой книги главную вы можете прочитать на сайте «Теории и практики», которая как раз переведена к сегодняшней лекции. Буквально скоро выйдет огромный том, посвященный теории поп-музыки, правда, на немецком языке. А также советую всем обратить внимание на замечательную выставку и каталог, который Дидрих Дидрихсен сделал этой весной в Haus der Kultur der Welt. Он назывался «The Whole Earth, California, Disappearance of the Outside». И эта выставка курировалась совместно с Ансельмом Франке, и это очень радикальный проект. Начнем.
Yeah, thank you very much, Didi. I'm going to let this film run now, but please, it's not so important to look at it. it is more like a distracted, as an offer for distracted illustration, and it should run now without sound. Yeah. Is this what I have to do to get it?
I think you can just switch off the sound.
I think the sound is off. Yeah, it's off. It's off. Yeah. So this is what you see here is one of the earliest feature-length film by Christoph Schlingensief. It's called Tunguska, and that's and I selected it for several reasons. One is because it deals with problems of art. It refers to problems of art. It has some kind of meta art component, and it deals a little bit with problems that might be the same problems that I'm talking about. It's very early. He did this when he was 23 years old, or 22 years old. Tunguska refers to this mysterious explosion on Russian territory, I think in the early 20th century. It was still not really explained what happened there. A huge kind of, yes, the mystery of this event is paralleled in this film with some document of a German avant-garde film of the 60s, a film that is as important and as crucial as this event, but has disappeared mysteriously, and that film is also called Tunguska. So the rest of the story is that you see these people here, they are the so-called avant-garde detectives. They are looking for the somehow lost holy grail of new German film. And then there we will also see a young couple that gets lost in the forest like in a fairy tale. It's very important it's important for my talk just to show you this because it deals with the young Christoph Schlingensief's obsession that in his lifetime, in the 80s when he made that film, the spirit of the new German film of the 60s, of Fassbinder, Herzog and so on, had already gone and had been buried by no good developments ever since. So it has to become a rescue. But on the other hand, it's also totally chaotic and makes no sense, and you just don't have to follow everything in it. It's just a wow. So Christoph Schlingensief died 3 years ago, and normally 3 years after the death of some person, people start to begin to forget the person. And this is not the case with Schlingensief. Just read his name in recent statements twice within a few days. The first one, one was by Shirley Langhoff. Shirley Langhoff is the new director of the Maxim Gorki Theater in Berlin. She was just appointed director. And she has her family is Turkish. She's the daughter of Turkish migrants. And so when the inauguration happened, there were lots of interviews with her. And in one interview, the interviewer asked her, what did she think when she heard in the news that there was a racist terror commando in Germany that had killed 10 Turkish Germans in the last 10 years, and this was revealed just recently, and there's a trial now against the terrorist group who did that. And she was asked, what did you think? And she answers, I had to think of Christoph Schlingensief. And this makes no sense at first. And she said, yes, Schlingensief did in the early 90s when there were other racist attacks. In the middle of one of his plays, in the Volksbühne, all of a sudden, he interrupts the scene, and he starts to tell his actors, kill foreigners, kill foreigners. And so they shoot on stage, and then it disappears again. And she said that this was so impressive for her because at that time she really felt threatened by racism. And all of a sudden, it became staged as something that was clearly not advocated, but on the other hand, it was also not just morally pushed away, but it became enacted. And that was something that she had to think of when she heard again of the return of racist practices. That she felt like something like that would have been would have interrupted the deadlock of discourse around racism. And the second time I heard the name in a recent text or read in a recent text was in connection with a film review. It was a film review on a documentary movie about this well-known feminist or pseudo-feminist movement called Femin. And this documentary was shown in Venice, at the Venice Film Festival. And in this film, this documentary, it is revealed that a cynical, non-feminist male entrepreneur was supposed to be in reality behind the movement, or has been for a while. And in this text, the reviewer said, when she heard that, or when she realized that in this film, she thought that the whole affair had neither been the story of the feminist movement, nor the hopes or the business idea of a cynical chauvinist man, but instead a project directed in heaven by Christoph Schlingensief. It reminded her of Schlingensief's project Foreigners Out, which was a spectacle he had organized in Vienna during a very important theater festival, Wiener Festival, in the year 2000. In Austria, the right-wing xenophobic and racist government just had come into power. Schlingensief had placed a container in central Vienna, across the street from the opera, and produced a fake TV show with seemingly real asylum seekers in this container. The show was based on the global success of the Big Brother format, only that those people who would be voted out of the container by the audience did not just have to leave the container, but the country. And the winner would get a permanent residency or even citizenship in Austria. This highly controversial and strongly debated project could be read, of course, in many different ways. It was read in many different ways. For instance, as picking up the standardized Austrian TV viewer where he or she feels at home in the TV watching scenario, and then in a perverse didacticism demonstrating his or her, or exposing his or her racism. Or as a hilarious exaggeration of what Austrian xenophobia was becoming and has become since. And finally, also just as a slew of controversial themes, xenophobia, reality TV, etc., served and delivered at the symbolic center of Austrian high cultural ambitions in front of the opera. But he also had a lot of criticism. Mainly he was accused of the exploitation of real asylum seekers. Later turned out that there weren't any involved, but as long as the production was running, people were supposed to think when they were watching it on TV that this was about a real attempt to show people out of the country. The parallel with the feminist story is that you have a spectacular public phenomenon that seems to imitate or even outdo classical forms of protest and public action, but without being easily readable. Hence, two vectors collide. The dynamics of the public, democratic, propagandistic, or plain popular performance, which tends to be as easily readable as possible, and the demonstration or exposure of complexity. And not just complexity of a theme or a narrative, but the complexity of the public performative situation per se. Who is acting, who is pretending, who is impersonating, what is presupposed, who is being addressed, and so on. I want to discuss the seeming contradiction between a desire to operate in front of the masses in direct contact, in immediate contact, and if possible, in Christoph Schlingensief's case, it was a megaphone in his hand, on one hand, and strict resistance to all kinds of simplifications against readability, especially the readability of simple moral and ethical investments in the context of Christoph Schlingensief's history as an artist of several media. And this is something that you could say about the things that he did as a film director, which he did in the first half of his career, but also as a theater director, which he has been between 1990 and his death, or as an artist who did public interventions, which started in the late 90s and continued to the mid-zeros. In all these media, you have this contradiction that he tries to be extremely visible, loud, mass-oriented, popular, but at the same time, he completely resisted understandability. He resisted the imperative of the public media that he would say something specific, that he would be, that he would make sense. He was loud, but he didn't make sense. And he was obviously talking about things that everybody was interested in. He was not making no sense about something that we didn't care about anyway, but he made, in a loud way, no sense about things that everybody was talking about. But also the proposal to think about Christoph Schlingensief for an audience in Moscow reached me as a very plausible idea. Schlingensief was a representative of a certain performance-oriented public program which has been associated with, explained by, and often simplistically reduced to the category of provocation. Artists and artistic groups who are known for provocations of large audiences are also well known in Russian contemporaneity. And there is a common trait shared by Austrian, German, post-war art with Eastern European art in general and Russian art specifically that goes way back. On the other hand, I thought that the reading of either Christoph Schlingensief specifically, or the complex public act in general, the contradictory category of the complex public act, only as provocation is misleading. I would propose to discuss this category and its history in the beginning of my talk. I would then propose a different reading of provocative as a method for enriching public discourse, an enrichment which is the opposite, or at least different, from the semantic narrowness of the concept of provocation. A discourse which had become impoverished and made scarce historically by several factors during the German 80s, where Schlingensief started to develop his artistic methodology, back then in the context of cinema television. And it's important that during this period, the observation that discourse became scarce, narrow, semantically oversimplified, had no relation to censorship. It was not that anything was forbidden to say, but still less things were said. And that is one of the diagnoses he strongly had brought forth in the early 80s, and that was shared by many other people. And that this conformism or this impoverishment of discourse was not so much on the level of ideas and political positions, but on the level of language, of a standardized language. And that especially was strongly felt in journalism, in general public debate. And finally, at the end, we'll talk about the countermeasures in the artistic and cultural strategies which Schlingensief uses in his film and theater work, and how I consider this an enrichment of discourse, and how this is, at least in Schlingensief's understanding, related to music. Historically, provocation was the non-American way of connecting with global post-war art. After fascism was over, after especially Germany and Austria had become part of the so-called Western Bloc, it was necessary for artists of all kinds to, on one hand, adopt to a new US-dominated art world, but on the other hand, to be able to offer something that was not entirely provincial, but still different. The notion of progress, artistic progress, had been the domain of an US-American definition of high modernism, not only commanding the cultural intellectual territory, but also the art market. This was not limited to the fine art in their market. Even French and Italian new wave cinema of the late 50s, early 60s reoriented themselves around 1960 towards an American ideal of cinema. Although in a somewhat broken sense, they rediscovered a canon of American films. The beginning of fluxes around 1960, the idea of the liberation of the artwork from any form of materiality, provided ideas and possibilities for all kinds of developments. But in German context, it gave birth to the charismatic and at the same time aggressive and warm-hearted, psychologically dominating performance artist. The first incarnation being Joseph Beuys. It was since then that the Western European, especially the German and Austrian contribution to the increasing internationality of the fine art world was not a specific way of producing artworks or a specific theory of it, but it was the charismatic aggressor, the warm-hearted charismatic aggressor from Beuys via Viennese actionism, German fluxes, even German exiles like Gustav Metzger in Britain picked up or developed the strategy. And of course, no one in those days would have described this as strategical. It was, of course, inner necessity, personal integrity, and above all, spiritual and magical reasons to become, as an artist, a type of vessel for content that was larger than yourself. But this was also proto-political. It was before 68. During 68, and after the cultural transformation of the 60s, this importance of the charismatic figure was not such an issue anymore. Joseph Beuys, for example, became a household name, and the confrontations between anti-authoritarian lifestyles and the values of the older generation, the so-called establishment, still strongly shaped by old Nazis, took many different forms, not at all monopolized by the performance of a charismatic and strong leader. Although one could observe an increasing frequency of gurus at that time of all kinds. Only much later, in the early 80s, when we already had this situation of what I call discursive scarcity, it seemed a viable strategy for someone like Schlingensief to adopt charisma again. Because to unfairly summarize the 70s, one can say that the 68 generation of rebellion and the ruling social democrats in Germany or in elsewhere had at least culturally reconciled themselves with each other by the introduction of some kind of tired bureaucratic consensus covering all former differences and, if you wish, contradictions of the political state of affairs. The only movement that was left in the early 80s was the peace movement or the anti-nuclear power plant movement, fighting for what was already achieved, the absence of war. They were no longer utopias, it was all about keeping the peace. In this climate of an ideological quietness, charisma could be an option again, like it was for other people at the same time, in punk rock, for example, or in art for someone like Martin Kippenberger. Although one has to say that within art, charisma had never been completely out of fashion, but Schlingensief came from cinema, and the transition you could sense in this field was the move from the dominance of people like Fassbinder, Herzog, Schröder, plus several schools of extremely experimental filmmaking, like, for example, Werner Nekes, the experimental filmmaker who was the teacher of Schlingensief, and moved from that kind of filmmaking to the social democratic didactic middle ground of the likes of Volker Schlöndorff, telling stories with didactic content. The German cinema of the 80s had become increasingly more TV-like. This is where Schlingensief started. This excessive conventionalization of the 1980s exemplary perpetrated in his beloved New German narrative cinema was a phenomenon of the era. And after all, against which every single subcultural counter-movement labored. And the fact that now the opponent was no longer the social democracy, but now Helmut Kohl was ruling in Germany. The level of confrontation, the intelligence of the level of confrontation was of course also shaped by the opponent, and so also opposition culture degenerated in a certain way. All these factors contributed to generate a widely shared sense of an incredibly confined and standardized cultural environment into which every oppositional discursive impulse, from punk, feminism, newly arriving French theory, and visual arts, was translated and thus curtailed and reduced. That no less but more would be more, that diversity and complexity would arise as context-independent values, has to do with this initial situation in which Christoph Schlingensief too began to wage his war on this specific scarcity, discursive scarcity. First by producing, that's him by the way, that's young Christoph Schlingensief, fighting against discursive scarcity with his own means. Now he's playing a character here that's called Hilf, which means help. So he found himself as a very young man in a situation where the shared diagnosis of his generation, the punk generation, was that the slowness, provinciality, didacticism, and overall boredom of German oppositional culture was an effect of democratic pluralism itself. Every opinion was acceptable, so there was no way to become really heard, to be really counted, except as just another creative subject. Young. The idea of provocation implies forcing the other, the authoritarian father, to listen to you. In the 80s, we witnessed how older brothers and fathers agreed in their language and their behavior. Therefore, simple craziness was not enough. There was the fear that any insistence on difference and difficulty would involuntarily help sustain the problem of the dead cultural landscape of West Germany. The problem, which was the insufficient reach and ineffectiveness of political and cultural action. The preceding generation had apparently enjoyed greater opportunities to exercise influence, but instead of using them, had come to an agreement with its father in the mode of a democratic balance of interests, a relativistic deal with plurality. Everything and everyone had the right to self-expression, as long as the public framework ensured from the outset that the position articulated in such fashion did not lay claim to any validity beyond its subjective or artistic truth. This diagnosis of the miserable state of affair gave rise to the idea that artistic production in particular now needed to insist on dimensions of truth that went beyond the contingency of the subject. The flirt with the totalitarian, which became widespread in the aftermath of punk, aimed against the relativism of mere subjectivity and the longing for the universal, thus converged in a grand paradox with the other great longing felt by artists who set out in the early 80s, to have justice done to the irreducible, the diverse, the different, in a single grand destandardization attack against consensus and comprehensibility. So we have again a similar opposition. On one hand, the ineffectiveness of cultural production under a certain pluralist leveling of differences leads to a yearning for some kind of totalitarian act, for some kind of truth act. And on the other hand, there is what the reason why one is against this leveling, against this pluralist leveling, is because one supports tiny differences, tiny molecular developments that, of course, cannot be added to acts of totalitarian truth gestures. So these two ideas are in a similar way contradicting each other, as were already the idea of provocation and complexity that I talked about earlier. In this situation, Schlingensief combined two things, a certain orientation towards the glorious and hilarious, extremely lively past of German late 60s cinema, with its charismatic characters, and the strategy of provocation, which at that time was rather known from the context of visual arts. Provocation seemed to direct charismatic provocation, seem to direct the paradoxical imperatives of the cultural situation of this generation. True representation of complexity, simple and effective aggression against the mainstream opposition of the peace movement and their artists. One advantage was that you could do something provocative and still something complex at the same time. You would provoke those who deserve it, and you feed the needs of those who deserve better. But the even better idea would be to synthesize the two goals, to provoke by unreadability. Of course, to do that successfully, you need an interested audience. There has to be some energy. And this only works if the elements that will be combined in an unreadable way are still recognizable as shocking or sexy or otherwise gross and drastic. Because if you cannot read it, it has to interest you. Otherwise, you will just ignore it. But how do you interest one in something he or she cannot read? In his early work in film, there have been already all kinds of obscuring comments, but also dull jokes, stylistic devices such as close-ups or musical crescendos that were employed against the normative function in narrative film. But the use was organized not so much by a superimposition of layers, as his later work, but rather by succession. Schlingensief was importantly not a magician of the deep focus serving to mobilize backgrounds in film. He was not a partridge of strange summer days. Instead, his films switched registers successively and at varying tempos. The camera work, the director's work with the actors, and the lighting heightened the confusing complexity, forever generating obscure corners in an architecture that would never become transparent. The films, not so much this one, but the later films, dealt with themes as drastic as possible. Terror, Hitler, Germany, Chainsaw Massacre. But within the abyss, the tones, the acting styles, the identifiability of logical consistencies switched between the grotesque and the serious, between the ridiculous and the goth pious. There's even a film called Egomania by Schlingensief with Tilda Swinton as main character, which can be read partly as some kind of a serious goth film. So not a show of virtuosity or as flowing from the artist's overall full heart, but in order to suppress from the very outset any unambiguousness of mood, of point of reference, of registers. The means to this end were quasi-theatrical even then. Fast, intense, and tight shooting schedules provided for intensity and exhaustion. A childishly and somberly unfettered camera sustained the balancing act between grand, crazed pretension and brute irony. Excessively well-known themes and stories, culled from the nasty bottom of popular culture, pulled the rug out from under self-involved experimental stretches of pleasure. This is the strategy between, let's say, 85 and in movies till 2000. It is at this point that Schlingensief's specific idea of art as a war on discursive scarcity attacks. One of his role models is Rainer Werner Fassbinder, and he extracted a greater personal commitment, more drastic acting, and a higher density of authenticity by inventing the fairly stable stylistic backdrop called Fassbinder movie. So there was a constant backdrop in Fassbinder, a certain genre-like quality that his films had. So that would function as a backdrop, and in the front you could become crazy, or act crazy, or do crazy things to the camera, or tell crazy stories. So Fassbinder was effectively employing a bipartite logic of constant and variable. Another role model of Schlingensief, Beuys, achieved the same effect by promoting the artistic persona, himself, the explicit center of his art. So in Beuys, the Beuys character, the Beuys figure, the man with the head, gets the status of the constant. Schlingensief, by contrast, casts both components as variables from the outset. Everything, even in his earliest films, undertake a very serious work on the cinematography. The lighting goes haywire, the camera refuses to occupy a vantage point that would offer a panoramic view, as well as on the plot. So, the love of extremism, grand themes, and personal obsessions. So both sides are variables. Both sides, there's nothing, you don't have a fixed constant, something that can be recognized and used all over again. On both sides, you have elements that are shaky up to contingent. The elements of avant-garde and experimental filmmaking that have informed his approach on the one hand, the traditions of New German narrative cinema after Oberhaus on the other hand. He lets them fight with each other, as it were putting them to the service of a mutual critique. Schlingensief draws on two mutually contradictory admired traditions, while also waging war on both. The now whiny New German narrative cinema that has grown old, and the self-centered esotericism and ineffectiveness of experimental film. So Werner Nekes, his tutor or his teacher on one hand, and Fassbinder on the other. Nekes being the experimentalist and Fassbinder the storyteller. And both having become at that point the experimentalist being more experimental, the storyteller even more narrative, and he lets them. He has them fighting. The Fassbinder actors he loves, from Volker Spengler to Ernst Harmer, as well as types like Alfred Edel, who you see here all the time, who represent the anarchic past of German film, and Ugo Kier, who embodies a certain less highbrow international fame, attained by the same tradition, are confronted with bizarre plots and, most importantly, with a constant violation of stabilized communities of filming language and technique. And it's remarkable that just after Fassbinder's death in '82, a few years later, maybe 3 or 4 years later, nearly half of the surviving Fassbinder actors worked with Schlingensief on a constant basis from there on. In the economy of the arts, the withdrawal of material does not always, nor even as is generally assumed, predominantly serve to avive disambiguation, heighten suspense, and impel the audience imaginative faculty to fill blanks according to its own fancy. Much more frequently, artificial discursive scarcity is an instrument serving the construction of unambiguousness, a false unambiguousness. There's much we might yet say at this point. The censorship authority seated at the center of artistic decision-making things, but if we did, what we offer the audience would become too confused and contradictory. So, I maybe have not articulated this well. What I'm trying to say is that that in the center of artistic decision making, we think, we as artists think that we shouldn't tell the audience too much. We are in the middle of ambiguity, but we decide to drop that, or to cut that, or to edit that, because otherwise we think we would lose any form of attention. So we assume that people would only follow with enthusiasm when they are motivated by simple statements and conservations. We decide to relate only the dialogue in the foreground and to summarize what is going on in the trees and shrubbery behind the speaking characters in a single sentence that informs the audience about the season and the weather. This is how conventional novels are written. You do not go too much into detail into what's going on in the trees behind the couple that is kissing. Shooting a movie, we position the microphone such that the birds remain background, just for the general feel, and set the focal length such that the leaves of the birch trees become a blurry green surface, the better to bring out the bodies of our protagonists. According to Deleuze, film since 1945 has also known the opposite strategy, the reinforcement of contingent background elements, the strengthening of atmosphere. Yet few filmmakers rival Christoph Schlingensief. Yet few filmmakers rival Christoph Schlingensief's explicit commitment to the permanent interpenetration of foreground and background, of event and commentary, of the reinforcement and the destabilization of the impression that has just emerged. So he's basically, that's maybe not so clearly visible in this film, but is the basis of his theater work, and of also many other works, is neither underlining a foreground, nor just reversing the foreground-background, figure-ground situation, but he's just strengthening both. And since his production at the Volksbühne, where he starts to work as a theatre director, which he has never done before, in the early 90s, his work in the theatre has achieved this effect by means of a principle of superposition of action and commentary. The commentary, the intervening or interpreting speeches delivered by stage characters, often by Schlingensief himself, are far from helping to clarify or lend pointed emphasis to the scene as they had done in Brecht's epic theatre. But instead do the opposite. They made the stage action more difficult to read and to translate. When a funny wig had just been recognizable as funny or as a parody, as associated with clowning, the next interpretive appearance would be bitterly serious and address specific issues of contemporary politics, like the example from the very beginning, something like a case of xenophobia. The aim of such intervention, however, was then recognizably not yet to prevent any sort of meaning fixing the action. It was motivated rather by a trust in forms of polyphony that were ultimately good when they remained anarchic and chaotic in the aesthetic of Christoph Schlingensief. So one has to imagine these. It was not only him, but there were a few actors, among them himself, who were constantly doing things like using a megaphone and speaking on top of everyone else, and even commanding 1/3 of the audience to leave the room and return to another door. And while the action on stage would go on. And would also start to talk about religion or something like that. But this strategy could even be there's even the climax to that. And that was only a combination of theatre and public interventions, actions such as the Chance 2000, the Opportunity 2000, Chance 2000, a political party that Schlingensief had founded in the late 90s and that had taken part in Germany's general election. And that also was a play. Chance 2000 also was a play, which was at the same time telling stories and playing theatre, and it was recruiting people to vote for this party or to become members of the party and so on. So public interventions such as the Chance 2000 at Berlin's Prater was the new level of where the principle of simultaneous and mutually superimposed actions would develop into a deliberate and refined device. There was still discontinuity in some change of register, now usually achieved by destabilizing the ontology of the stage situation. So he all of a sudden had in a stage production of Shakespeare's Hamlet, there were real neo-Nazis, and they were all of a sudden paralleled with the killings in Hamlet, and so that was something where all of a sudden the ontology was. This is real now. These are real Nazis. How can we bear to be in the same room with them? So he still had these kind of interruptions in those plays and in public public interventions, but they were now, aside from these strong interruptions, the other format of the superimposition had become more and more pleasant. It had become kind of, it had a certain beauty of polyphony. from these kind of interruptions of the ontology, on a perfectly normal Schlingensief evening, one saw the accumulation of many references, hints at actions and events taking place in front of each other, that the organization of all these elements, tying them together at some point, inevitably became musical. It was some kind of organization that could no longer deal with the semantics, with the overwhelming polyphony of semantics, but had to deal with how many actions in time and how many actions at the same time. And that are, of course, the basic of musical thinking. Yet the two kinds of disruptions and multiplications installed to counteract one another, lofty pretensions and black irony, the pathos of art and an acute diagnosis of contemporary state of affairs, not only make it impossible to fix what is going on, to pin it down to a semantic continuum narrated in the logic of constant and variable, they are exposed, moreover, to another form of pressure, an external goal of Christoph Schlingensief's work that he himself repeatedly emphasized and demanded, an effect on the society outside of the theater. Such efficacy is not to be had in a simple mechanistic fashion, and is often not even legible as the objective, motivating artistic decision. But that does not change the fact that we must, from the standpoint of society, render the sort of judgment on art that calls its lack of efficacy failure. Such failure was Schlingensief, in a much quoted slogan, famously apostrophized as chance, as an opportunity. He said failure is an opportunity. Or marks the relation to social reality of all artistic endeavors that exert themselves in the pursuit of intentions. If an artistic intervention is able to articulate a certain intention it wants to have, it can only fail. An intention on society, not any intention, but if an artistic endeavor says, my intention is to with art to better this part of the world, it will fail. But failure in Schlingensief is an opportunity. The helplessness in the face of any social mission, however, becomes apparent not so much in their direct relation to the audience, which hardly knows any different anyway, but instead in the action and behavior with which the agents on the stage, within the wide cube, beyond the fourth wall, and in other symbolically protected art spaces encounter one another. Intention carrying on in the void looks so desperate, so helpless, because it achieves nothing. And that ultimately goes against everything intention stands for. It is not something it can live with. If Christoph Schlingensief sees a chance, an opportunity in this fundamental failure of artistic action, the failure must first be staged as such. It must be visible. It must be exaggerated and exposed. Yet exaggerated and exposed not in a stylized representation of the symptoms, but as the clearly recognizable sound of a profound dissonance. For example, the two sentences, the two propositions, art really might make a difference, versus let's not kid ourselves, it's not going to make a difference. So these two sentences are supposed to be staged and positioned clearly both at the same time. So the both are supposed to be right at the same time, although they contradict each other. And let's also not kid ourselves, let's not try again and again and forever afresh. Let's try instead to find out what is attractive at the core of this failure. Attractive to its producers as well as its spectators. Why do we constantly want this? Why is this dissonance so beautiful? Beautiful not as an exception of the world, as a destination for escapist expeditions, but as a way to get by in the world, in the political world. So what would this dissonance be this beautiful dissonance. It is, in Schlingensief, never just an aesthetic impression, informing us about the relationship between art and the world, but time and again the result actively generated in the stage action. Have a seat. There are plenty of seats over there.
You want to stay at?
So, what would this dissonance be? What would it lead to? It is in Schlingensief never just an aesthetic impression informing us about the relationship between art and the world, but time and again the result actively generated in stage action. So it's not just the fact that we are, it's not just a relation between the art and the world as being separated and as art not having any influence on the world, but it is based on, it is also generated in the action on stage itself. And one of the conflicts or dissonances that are in the stage action are the conflicts of the many different art forms that are part of the theatre experience or theatre production in general. Theatre is composed of several art forms. Theatre is singing and dancing and building paintings, three-dimensional paintings and sculptures, and performing and so on, all at the same time. And these difference between the different art forms is something that also has been exaggerated and exposed by Schlingensief, especially since he has been active in so many different art forms himself. So, getting the world of the arts to unite harmoniously around one table in the theatre is just as impossible as getting the real world to come together in the political sphere. In the films, this basic idea appears in the fact that the two or more channels of production goading each other on without ever being reducible to the economy of figure and ground, the drastic scene, the violent narrative plot, are counterbalanced by the insane world reference, the combination of the brute and lowbrow with historical catastrophe and twilight of the gods. In the theatre, it is by contrast more and more the antagonism of the arts. I'm referring not only to the conventional genres define the attempt to integrate them into the total work of art, the Gesamtkunstwerk, but importantly also to the competing and mutually contradictory conceptions of art Schlingensief himself champions. For they have only one thing in common: the vanishing point of effect. Schlingensief's strong idea that art should have an effect, or the failure of effect. Among the most conspicuous contradictions is that between a barrier that constantly seeks to seize the audience, to grab it and influence it, and simultaneously the hermeticism of a highly elusive, densely superimposed and often privatistic way of conducting the action in mise en scène. This contradiction continues in the gradual conquest of the depths of the scenic space we observed in recent years in the later work of his life, since he did in the Wagner Festival in Bayreuth the staging of Parsifal, of Wagner's Parsifal, and produced several successors on other stages that were plays that had certain art theoretical components, like Atta Atta, Die Kunst ist los, which was a play about in which Alan Caprow, the inventor of the happening, plays a role, or Otto Mühl, the Viennese actionist, and so on. In all these plays, Schlingensief has actors doing expeditions in the real world. They not only infiltrate, coming from the theater space outside in the world, filmed, and then the film being shown in the theater while they're doing it, but sometimes it's a prepared film that only acts as if they were doing it, but sometimes also they leading the entire audience outside of the theater, making them doing something public situation. The same contradiction then reappears in the offers to contemplate complex structures to quietly reconstruct them in the mind. Offers that are at odds with the insistence with which Schlingensief time and again asserts the external reference of this art. The insistence on necessarily polyphonic complexity to look inside and outside at the same time stands in a similar contradiction to the urge to understand in a way that would have immediate consequences. So this is highly complex. You have to concentrate, you have to go inside yourself, you have to really find out what's going on, and you have to act. How come you're still sitting there and are you contemplating? Okay, but I want you to act at the same time, and constantly signaling this to this audience. Reading the obituaries and recollections that have appeared in a flood of publications after his death, you will find several that use the formula of the paradox to summarize the person and persona of Schlingensief. It is not my aim here to take a different position. There is a paradoxical task to the construction of probably any productivity. The problem to be solved that must not be solved with a solution. There are, moreover, always the individual colors in which a living individual gives concrete form to this paradox. I merely want to add something to these paradoxes. How a given construction relates to artistic constructions. I would prefer to return to the category of dissonance here and replace paradox with dissonance. The specific dissonance embodied in superpositions of plenty of contradictory layers in a theater, in the contradiction we already talked about. The same obituaries and recollections also spoke a great deal about the total work of art, the famous and infamous Gesamtkunstwerk. The Gesamtkunstwerk is always lurking around the corner whenever the charismatic and the provocative have their appearance. Since its main idea is not only the reconciliation of the arts, but also between the arts and reality. The charismatic figure becomes, more often than not, such a kind of stand-in for this reconciliation, because this charismatic figure exists in the world and in the artwork, and it is at the same time also like the representative of all these different artworks. Christoph Schlingensief and Joseph Beuys and Chukhrov, they all have this in common. And since there's always a desire to have a direct consequential result from art practice and reality, in case of these people, Schlingensief also embraces the reconciliation between art and reality in the ideology of the Gesamtkunstwerk. Although, entre nous, it is worth remembering that this reconciliation is not the same art-life relation that the avant-garde was after. The Gesamtkunstwerk had a different idea from reconciliation between the arts than the avant-garde. This reconciliation in Wagner and other Gesamtkunstwerk artists as finding a new ideal place for art in reality and in society, and not lifting or getting rid of the distinction. It meant finding the right place. For example, in Bayreuth. And not that art would take over reality as it does in avant-garde. Schlingensief, so much can be said, was after some kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, but mixed with ideas of the avant-garde. There were also some other good reasons that led to the decision to shelve the reconciliation of the arts and between the arts and non-arts as bourgeois illusion, which was the general agreement in decades of criticality, 60s, 70s. Still, these good reasons to get rid of it do not relieve us of obligation to address the perfectly justified question to which the Gesamtkunstwerk was the wrong answer. We might say that Schlingensief raised these questions incessantly and accordingly also had to play the public audience that was of such significance to a contemporary version of the problem. Yet as early as the late 90s, in a conversation about his conclusions from the Chance 2000 project, he surprised me in a conversation by using musical metaphors to describe the grand dissonance, the culture of superimposition at the core of his theatrical productions, as well as the core of the relation of his art to reality. As became clear during this conversation, at the latest and then even more evident the production he directed during the last 10 years of his life, he needed to keep this dissonance this disharmony, this failure present, and to elaborate it. And his name for that was music. Music was that elaboration, He mentioned the work of the Samra Orchestra, the ensemble of a few dozen musicians and dancers led by the lithomaniac, free jazz pioneer and director Samra, who died in 1993, as exemplifying the sort of radical and disharmonious forms he was interested in. Forms that nonetheless permanently addressed social tensions and kept it alive. You can say that, picking up a thought from the beginning, that the provocation by unreadability, the provocation that needs some energy to be of interest because it's unreadable and it only gets our attention when it gets something worse from somewhere else, the energy, that this has been, could have been provided by a music or the like the one that Samra did. And it would also kind of react or do something with the fact that the situation of provocation is a different one today, that when provocation was first launched in the 60s or 50s and 60s, it was to make silent fathers speak by edible sons. The edible sons tried to make the fathers who would not speak, force them to speak. But now we live in a world in which we are constantly made to communicate, and we are forced to communicate, not what we want to hear, and not the way we want to communicate, but communication is all around us. So unreadability is really much more of an option than unreadability combined with energy. Staged in the home of the Gesamtkunstwerk, the production of Parsifal, Diedrich and Bayreuth, which was surrounded by scandal early on and drew the vehement antagonism of the Wagner clan, was in this sense the first appearance of Schlingensief's negative Gesamtkunstwerk, a mise en scène of dissonance and the non-reconciliation of the arts and between the arts and the environment, but within the framework that defined this non-reconciliation as its field of operation. The music as it developed in the free and improvised format of the past 50 years might be opera as some kind of model for the dissonance between all kinds of practices, the stage dissonance that he was interested in. This was an opera that he had shown in Brussels, and it had taken from the original Ginono opera only a few recorded elements, and also some elements of the narrative. And then it had brought all the people from Burkina Faso, the African state of Burkina Faso, and contemporary musicians of Berlin to completely redo all these things, again simultaneously. In the shadow of the other Gesamtkunstwerk, the non-negative, the one by Wagner, the process I'm talking about, the process of musicalization, began with the initial subjection of the non-musical elements of production, the movable stage design on a rotating stage, projections, the movements of the singing actors, all these other elements that are about movement in time, they were all subjugated to musical ideas in his production of Parsifal, to the musical tempo of the orchestra under Pierre Boulez. But then this synchronization, this, as if he was saying, so now we are synchronized, now we are, all these different things are no longer dissonant, they are synchronized. But then the synchronization was blown to pieces by the incorporation of all the other registers, the registers of content, first and foremost among them. The second act of this Parsifal already takes place in Africa, and it's about the confrontation of this kind of slightly strange idea of Africa, but nevertheless, with this Wagnerian narrative. The consequence, however, was the project of a festival hall in Opera Village, so the classical Gesamtkunstwerk idea, but in Africa, which Schlingensief subsequently took on, and which took quite concrete shapes in Burkina Faso. For Schlingensief, always through the conditions of production and their history, a politically unreconciled art and its counterpart into the mix, particularly when working in constellations such as Bayreuth, that seem to have achieved a purely aesthetic solution, generating never a synthesis but always only fresh disclosures. That the failure of art would today, after the death of this initiator, continue to play his music as a project in the real world is a failure of failure. So that because the opera village is still there and it's constantly built. So this is the failure of failure, strangely beautiful and perverse. But it is possible. Music in this sense is the category that combines the impossibility of communication, which is the disease provocation tries to overcome, with the very organization of this impossibility. The difference between Schlingensief's category of music and the average idea of music is that his music is still made of gestures, words, fragments, of narratives, postures, politics, and broken intentions, of all kinds of failures, so that we actually see the whole time what it is that fails, which of our engagements and intentions do not work, and at the same time demonstrates that we have no choice but try again slightly different. The negation of Gesamtkunstwerk and reconciliation by musicalization, so, does in all seriousness lead to the building of another Bayreuth, as if there were nothing to be learned from history except one thing. This time it is in Africa. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Diedrich, for this insightful and wonderful analysis. Есть ли вопросы или комментарии? Okay, then I take the advantage of maybe ask a few questions that appear along with the talk. Well, you made a very important statement about the contradiction between his striving towards mass culture, his striving to be visible, to be present, to make operas, to be on TV, to be part and parcel of the attention of the audience on the one hand, and to make his statement and message unreadable and subversive and twisted. Something that actually is quite problematic for avant-garde, because the avant-garde, as it was stated by situationists, as it was stated in works by Benjamin when he was claiming the task of an artist as producer who is completely rejecting opaque and oblique means of expression, as is trying to enter the society directly and is relying on society, is believing the society itself is as goodwill and as elaborate and as refined and as artistic as the artist himself. This probably in the legacy of avant-garde might be dependent on the fact that avant-garde was trying to sublate art in the life that tried to be artistic itself. So it tried to be utilitarian for the life that was not utilitarian itself. And therefore this sublation was, as Hitlerstyle, by the way, emphasizes in her book, Wretched of the Spring, this sublation still was in favor of art for the masses and the majorities who are themselves turning life into art. Whereas what happens in the conditions of the global middle class policy, the global goodwill, social democracy rhetoric, is that the contemporary artist who is relying on the social paradigm and social practice is addressing the audience that claims some kind of middle class Spießbürgerlich ethics, and then you have to degrade the artistic intensity, you have to degrade the artistic means, while bringing democratic provisions into art makes art degrade into something that is not just non-artistic, but is even from ethical or political point of view quite loose. And in many artistic practices which are democracy oriented, we see this ideology of looseness and ideology of just being social monitoring, ideology of translucence, transparency, understandability, readability. But my question is the following. Can we then claim that either avant-garde is impossible in the conditions of this post-Borgist or post-structuralist theory? Or maybe we could say that Schlingensief stays to be a postmodern artist.
In the sense that he would be loose in that sense too.
No, he not to be loose, not to be democratic. He is obliged to be twisted, postmodernist, to be a mass artist, but at the expense of trash, at the expense of causing aversion, to be part and parcel of the mass culture, but in the regime and in the context when mass culture is a lowbrow and terribly even disgusting culture, because disgusting culture can also somehow be touching for the masses. And he all the time tries to play with this mass instinct through violence, through sexuality, intensifying them and interpreting them from film, from music, from pop culture as well. But at the same time, he tries to establish his own language of nihilism, of negativity, of contradiction, of all the time exaggerating these elements. And my question is that he makes it unreadable, okay, but why does he make this unreadability at the expense of such obscenity and such offense, not offense, no, not offense, insult to a certain extent. Sorry.
Yeah, I think this is a good and question that leads to different, I think, to different problems that have to be addressed in that context. One is that I think it's a long story how different forms of the masses or popular culture come into become testing grounds or material for post-war artists who have already learned the historical lessons of failure of the avant-garde. So they are very different, I think. One would need to do something on public places, but otherwise do not follow any mass cultural components. Others would be to embrace mass culture as simple, and another one would to embrace it as low, vulgar, and evil. And of course, all these are reductions of the other of petit bourgeois art or middle class art. They are all constructed from the standpoint of middle class art, and so they look for their other as only under one angle, because in order to have this binary thinking, they have to think of themselves as one fixed point from which they are able to look at it. And here I would credit Schlingensief, at least in the long run, with the insight that the other of petit bourgeois artists is not just the negation of one idealized quality of the medieval dramas, but it is different or it is other in its complexity, and so the of course to think of it as trashy, as vulgar and horrible is already an attempt to glorify it. I think it's an attempt to not just discredit it as low, because that is already this is connected with quality of transgression, and trash is transgressive and obscenity is transgressive and so on. That could be the thing, but still too stupid. It's still not too stupid, but still too simple. And I think in the long run, his learning process or his development had a lot to do with acknowledging just the basic complexity of it, and also a bit the complexity of even constructing it, or not in the long run not being able to construct any other. And so I think the insight that whatever you're doing, you should do for the wrong audience or with a different audience is basically that's what it leads to. It is not so much the complexity problem that you have, and also the beauty of the complexity cannot be achieved by the way you are composing or constructing your work of art, but the way how you make audience mix and meet that are socially not sought to meet. And this includes not only the empirical social objects that we call audience, but also the producers on stage, or the producers in the film. There is this unbelievable scandal of when there are real neo-Nazis on stage, or when there is a dying person on stage. That are also, of course, always on the border of a certain logic of exploitation that is pretty much at the core of the worst forms of cultural industrial production. But one can say one needs to pass this, one needs to traverse this.
I think I agree, because along with the foreground element of transgressive dispositions which he uses, he's doing something else than the Viennese actionists who were just representing this despair and to a certain extent this hardcore, direct transgressive act, because as soon as he presents something transgressive, then he is again, as you say, shifting the register to something else, and this complexity shows itself exactly as the form of music. So he just uses the first plane of transgressive elements, which are transgressive images, to construct a very complex form out of them through rhythming, through registering, through shifting the registers, and by the end of the piece you see how many layers are there and how many statements collide, how many things intervene and intertwine. This I definitely agree with. But another thing that is really surprising and interesting is this counter, or rather superimposition of two quite incompatible things. On the one hand, the grandeur of religion, the grandeur of the themes of epics, the grandeur of the form of opera, the grandeur of some musical quotations that he uses from classical music, and Wagner all the time that he is quoting in Mea Culpa. And on the other hand, this mockery, the mockery that always counteracts with this kind of grandeur. And you can never decide. As soon as you decide that, oh, this guy is mocking everything and making everything obscene, although in a very complex way, you all of a sudden have some glimpses of sentimentality, then some glimpses of relying on religion. And this comes out at the later period.
Yeah, I totally agree, and I was just thinking that the nihilism that you mentioned in your first question, always the nihilism, yeah, it comes with a messianism at the same point, or simultaneously. I would say that this is like a physical. It comes across like a physical notion, like an itching that forces you to. But the other way around of it's the other way around of the itching that you have in or the impulse to laugh when you're not supposed to laugh, as in to laugh at a funeral or to laugh in class when the teacher is serious or something like that. But this reversed the kind of the impulse to become grandiose or serious or religious. That is what you can observe in this. It all takes place at one point in the world of irony, and so mockery is not going anywhere. But this is not a conscious decision of his, like, oh, we do not live in that world anymore, but in that world, so we have to change our strategies. It's really like, very much also on the level of personal presentation of his own playing as an actor or performer, where you can sense that what you just described.
Thank you. Any comments or questions?
Хотела попросить вас прокомментировать проект Да, слышно?
Алло?
Нет? Да, ну, просто вопрос очень простой про последний проект Шлингензифа на Венецианской биеннале. Это, конечно, не театральное действие, проект, который был реализован уже без его участия. Просто в связи с вашей идеей о диссонансе и безопасности, вот это, ну, пожалуйста, можно расскажите ваше впечатление об этом проекте художественном?
He was there twice. He was there with the Church of Fear, and then he was there again after his death. So you mean the first or the second? The second. Well, I mean, that is the problematic thing, because he wasn't around to do that. It was not so much a work by him, but an attempt to collect things that he had done and somehow show them in a way that could have been the way he would have done it. But I think this was more, I mean, the single objects that were there, the films or the leftovers from productions, or they were of course all authentic. But I don't know if, and I also know that he actually, when he was still alive, planned to have some kind of church-like presentation. But the way I knew him, I would have guessed that he would have done something against the closeness of the presentation. He would have done something on top of it. It wouldn't have been just the presentation like that. So I think it would have had more dissonance if he would have been able to finish it himself.
еще есть вопрос? Okay, I wanted to mention a Russian actionist, Oleg Bulik, probably you've heard of him, because in the 90s making the performance, a radical performance imitating a dog and attacking people in the street, and he did that in Sweden, at some other places, and he made a series of those transgressive performances. However, these performances, in comparison with the acts of Janis actionism or Schlingensief, were neither as radical as Janis actionism, nor as subversive and complex as Schlingensief pieces. But on the other hand, strangely, these performative, anarchic behaviors, in the end, somehow ended up in this alter-religious, quasi-religious spaces, because one of his latest works was also some kind of Gesamtkonstrukt, where he tried to unite all the performances ever done in Russia in the 90s as some kind of shadow play. So this was some kind of alter-Russian church with these radical actions becoming the presence of shadows. On the other hand, he did this staging of Pergolesi, some kind of religious oratorio. Also trying to subvert it with certain space work, of course less efficiently and in a more coherent way, but still there is this strange, I don't know, strange logic that radical, schizophrenic, transgressive behaviors somehow tend to this kind of, an anarchy somehow wants to go to church. Why is it?
Well, I mean, there's
because church is another extreme, or because church contains this intensity of, I don't know, intensity of owning the world, of comprising the world, of also having the world, and you want to compete with this power that this institution has, but with your counter power, maybe.
Well, because church offers to artists in a traditional sense a certain legitimate function and job. Artists have a job within church, a well-defined job, and it solves all their problems. Connection to reality, connection to outside world. So it is some kind of a possible place to go if you have no longer any patience to live with your longings or your unfulfilled or work through, then it's always a good kind of asylum. But it's of course connected with a certain regression. I mean, it also of course depends on how the real existing institution of the church is contextualized in such works. That's another question. But even the look of the sacred and altars and this whole thing. Another thing is that it basically the problems that are solved by retreating to the church are not so often contemporary problems. They are maybe problems rather of the first generation of ethical provocateurs. Then they are the second generation who are struggling with the cultural industry instead of, or especially advanced forms of cultural industry, as the ones who struggle with authoritarian, silent, post-fascist fathers. So I mean, for example, for someone like Stockhausen, or people like this generation, or even boys, what was a very religious character.
Yeah, that's a very good observation that the first generation starting with the power and totality, and somehow all the time refers to church, and the creative industry is not interested. This I mentioned because if in this very transgressive and crazy film called Trash Universal or Trash... yeah.
Terror 2000.
Terror 2000, but at the same, when this monster Christ is born, a crazy film.
Well, isn't that the 100 Days of what or something?
No, it's called Trash Universal.
Ah, okay, yeah.
Which was done in 1996, and it tries to reconstruct the story of Maria and the birth of Christ. Christ through a detective story is very perverse. When Christ was born not by Immaculate Conception, but from the lover of her husband who did not fuck her because he was gay, something like that. So it's radically subversive, radically obscene, but there are all the time references to church, to Christ, and I was comparing it to the act of Pussy Riot and their rhetoric, and in comparison with the Pussy Riot statement, it seems to be like extremely much more insulting, because the insult that there was in the action of Pussy Riot was predominantly insult to the government and the president, rather than Christianity or Christ or religion at all. But don't you think that there is this shift, on the one hand, the mockery of the religion and the reference to religion all the time in early years, but then religion starts to be more encompassing, because in this opera, Kirche, how do you call it?
Church of Pain, Church of Fear. Yes.
Church of Fear.
Yeah.
Yes, he tries to all the time subvert the meaning of the church, but there is some kind of this physiology, the disease, and the weak human being who is dying, and at the same time having nothing around him, no people, no society, everything is evacuated, except for this empty place of the church. And in Mea Culpa, you all again have these images of Pietà, the images of some kind of this little woman who's all the time playing the Catholic priest or whatever. And this again was some kind of confirmation for me that, confirmation to a certain extent of the narcissism, that, well, he's a great artist, he's a fantastic person, figure, and thinker, but still, even in his political statement, even when he goes to Africa to just socialize opera, he still remains to be this person who is completely obsessed with his own charismatic presence, which doesn't enable him to see the other person. No?
Yeah, there's something to it. I mean, I think the difference between I think there are two ways of criticism of religion or art against religion. One is to criticize the politics of religion, and that was definitely the case of Pussy Riot, I think. Whereas the case of Schlingensief is having grown up in a religious family, and it's the psychological conditioning that you went through as being educated religiously. And I think that's his a lifetime obsession of his, and it's a really strong thing, and it goes into different directions, and yes, and that I think is it's a banal psychological explanation, but it's about the psychology of being religious or overcoming to be religious. And yes, there is about the narcissism. I think that there is a problem with this form. There's also, I would say, that's also my main criticism of Schlingensief is that the charismatic presence of one figure, one man in most cases, as the solution, as the suture of all these dissonant components of the work that are so meticulously exhibited and constructed in their dissonance is of course a problem. If all the work is about the coexistence of contradictory things and contradictory levels of understanding and contradictory audiences and contradiction somehow organized as music and then the music again disturbed by semanticism and so on. And then there's one opera that not only connects all these things, but also connects them with reality. That is, of course, the charismatic person is a too simple solution for that. And it's of course also kind of dangerous and politically problematic. But I would credit him here, and this might now sound strangely religious, but I would credit him that he solved this problem because after his death, these works continue without him and without the presence and without the narcissism. I mean, of course they don't in the same way, but somehow they do, yeah.
Thank you. So if there are no questions, let's thank Diedrich.
Thank you.